So now we're going to talk about the barriers that might exist to someone accessing cervical screening. So, as you can imagine, as you've already guessed, I'm going to talk about the lack of accessible information. So, we'll go into this later on, but if somebody's invitation that they receive from the screening hub isn't accessible to them, then immediately, straight out the gate, a huge barrier to somebody going to their cervical screening or even knowing what the appointment or letter is about. So that's your first big barrier. Some other barriers could be physical mobility, practices not being able to accommodate people with physical disabilities, the Mental Capacity Act, once again, maybe being misunderstood or not used properly or appropriately, fear and discomfort around the procedure, as of all of the cancer screening services, this one is the most invasive. So this one will have a lot more fear and anxiety around this procedure specifically. A lot of myths around eligibility that have been spread over the years that might need fact checking. People might need some more up-to-date information being given to them. And then the barrier of people with a learning disability being ceased from the recall list without their knowledge by people that have deemed they do not need it. So that's also a huge barrier to cervical screening. So here I am again, talking to you once more about accessible information. It's something I spend a lot of my life talking about because it is so important, as if healthcare isn't accessible, then we're really letting people down. And I think if we're giving people information and we're wanting people to access cervical screening, we need to make sure that we're meeting somebody where they are and engaging with them in a way that they can access. So this accessible information could be easy read. There is lots of really good easy read about cervical screening. I've been working on a project for the last year where I've been making easy read resources for GP practices about cervical screening, and all those resources are available. So these are things like appointment letters, invitation letters, booklets about what cervical screening is, some top tips about what might help you attend your appointment, things about reasonable adjustments that are available. All the results letters are in easy read. So it's just about thinking, where do we send things to people? Where do we meet people at their journey of cervical screening? Does it exist in an accessible format, or can we make it in an accessible format? You know, we can make easy read quite easily, or if you want to get in contact with us at the health facilitation team, we're really happy to work with you and give you the skills to make your own accessible information in an easy read format. That's something we do offer, and we'll be happy to work with you on that. It doesn't have to be easy read though. Some people might not like the easy read format, and some people might prefer things like videos. So there are lots of videos online, people talking about cervical screening, talking about the procedure, what's expected of the person. Or you could even think about making your own. So if somebody is thinking about coming to cervical screening at your GP practice or wherever you are and is a little bit anxious, things like a video walkthrough of starting right from the car park, just filming, walking through where you'd go, what room is it going to be in, what does the equipment look like. You can even say who's going to be doing the appointment, just things like that that can really help somebody in this situation. So again, for cervical screening, desensitization can be a really important tool. So this could be offering somebody an appointment simply to come and look around, meet you, see the room, see what equipment will be used, ask loads of questions, with absolutely no expectation at the end that this will end in cervical screening. So just building someone's confidence up slowly. Even if someone's coming for 5 minutes for the first time to meet you, and that's the goal, and we meet that goal, then that's fantastic. That is another step on the journey. And building up slowly with people might be a really good way of building somebody's confidence. It could also be hosting an event, maybe, if you've got the time and resources at your practice. If you want to invite people with a learning disability come, just have a look around. Could be a chance there for opportunistic cervical screening, but no expectation, just letting people come, ask the questions that they've got, and giving people some information that they can take away, and just having kind of that positive contact with them to start them off. So on the topic of desensitization, Sean's going to drop in and talk about the benefits of desensitization and why people should really take the offer.
When you get a letter about having a smear test, or when you need to go to the hospitals and doctors about it, ask them if you have a look around. That'll help you to stop you being nervous and scared. And not just that, getting a letter about having a smear test, it can be scary. That why we do ring them up, make sure, and ask them about having a look around the place. And not just that, when you're there at hospital and doctors, it's okay, you can ask questions about it too. Because having a smear test, yeah, it can be scary, but when you get the right information about it, and when you have a look around, your fears and confidence be better.
Knowledge sharing, letting people know about it, I think is a huge way of breaking down barriers. There is a lot of misinformation and myths about people with a learning disability and cervical screening. A lot of people that I've spoken to while doing this project have been told in the past that they don't need cervical screening and they will never need cervical screening. So obviously then have just not re-engaged with the service when that might not be true. And people have assumed that because they have a learning disability, they're not sexually active and therefore don't need to come for cervical screening. This unfortunately is a myth that still persists, where people think that a person with a learning disability is not and will never be sexually active. You know, people with a learning disability are just like everybody else. And it's important not to assume things about people when you meet them, especially if you're going to an appointment and saying that they're not sexually active or kind of assuming or insinuating it. Someone then might not want to correct you and tell you that you're wrong, especially if they think that they shouldn't be. If somebody has the opinion that someone with a learning disability doesn't have sex, they might feel like then they shouldn't be telling you that they have sex because that might be wrong. Unfortunately, also people with a learning disability are very vulnerable to abuse in all forms, including sexual abuse. So it's important to keep in the back of your mind that this is something that is a risk with somebody with a learning disability, and it is unfair to them to say that you are 100% sure at all times that somebody hasn't had any form of sexual activity for whatever reason. So busting myths about who should and shouldn't have cervical screening, is a big part of this. So if you give people the knowledge of who should and shouldn't have it, then it goes a long way into helping people find out if it is right for them. As we've talked about as well, just talking about it more in terms of coming to have a look around, using other appointments like someone's annual health check or appointments with social prescribers, about other things, just to kind of drop in the fact that, maybe their cervical screening is due and here's some information about it. So I think talking about it as much as possible, and kind of taking away the taboo about it with people with a learning disability is a really big tool in our arsenal. Often people with a learning disability are left out of the conversation as people think it doesn't concern them or it's not for them, but that's just not true, and it's unfair, and it does just widen that inequality there. So it's really important that we can take steps to correct that. As we've discussed, reasonable adjustments are different for everybody because they're based on somebody's specific need in that particular moment. So someone might need different reasonable adjustments for things like attending a GP appointment, attending the dentist, attending their breast screening, and then attending cervical screening. So I suppose the question would be, what reasonable adjustments could we feasibly provide somebody with to try and help cervical screening be more successful? So as always, we should always ask, because somebody might have a great idea, have something that's worked for them in the past, or if they've never done cervical screening before, they might have a reasonable adjustment that they do for other appointments that they think might help. So it's always worth asking and working with that person to try and figure out what that's going to look like. In terms of the barrier we've spoken of physical accessibility, if somebody maybe requires a hoist to get on a bed, if somebody's in a wheelchair, or if somebody has mobility issues, they can't get on the bed in the GP surgery, we can ask, is this more reasonable to be done at the person's home? Or is this something that needs referring to colposcopy? Even if it's a non-physical accessibility issue, if somebody is intensely anxious about coming into the GP surgery, it might be reasonable to go and do it at home and provide them with an area and a surrounding that's going to make them feel more at ease for the situation. Like we've spoken about before, you could be looking at where this person is waiting. Could this person wait outside and then receive a phone call to go straight through to the room so we don't elongate the stretches of people waiting in communal areas, especially if they have sensory difficulties that would mean they can't tolerate being in a very loud area or a very bright area? Can we think of having the first appointment of the day so there isn't any waiting around? They can bring somebody with them, somebody that they trust, who can stay with them for as long as they like. Can we agree to play a specific song in the room when they come in just to make them feel a bit more at ease, something that they like? Or we can talk to them about things that they can bring in from home that they find comforting to help them get through the appointment. And then an important one as a reasonable adjustment would be, how are we going to communicate in that moment if you would like the procedure to stop? So some people that might be a verbal, can we stop? No. For other people who are nonverbal or have altered communication methods, it could be holding up a specific symbol, it could be a specific movement, it could be a specific vocalization or noise. So nailing down those things that are going to make the situation work as well as possible are a really great way of working with somebody to try and figure out what we can do. Now we're going to hear from Sally, who has very kindly agreed to share her story with us about cervical screening and how difficult it was for her to access cervical screening.
Hi, I just wanted to give you a bit of the feedback really about my experiences. Well, it's taken me 6 years to be able to get a smear test done, because I've been to several GP practices and I've asked for like medication to like relax me, but I haven't been prescribed it. Now, for somebody with a learning disability, that's really difficult, because it takes them a lot of effort and a lot of courage to speak up about that. Recently, I was successful because they listened to what I had to say, but it took 6 years for them to listen to what I had to say. My support workers would advocate on my behalf, but I just want to say that it must be so hard for other people like me, or other people that are non-verbal, that can't speak up. Health professionals need to listen to us more. They need to walk in our shoes. They need to communicate better with us in a way that we can understand, so not use any jargon. They need to communicate with us in like easy read. I just think that people with a learning disability need more support to attend these appointments. Health professionals want us to go to these appointments, but they don't think about the support that we need to go to these appointments. Like, have you got anyone with you that you trust? Have you got support workers that you trust? Have you got like a family member that you trust to go with you? Have you got a close friend that can go as well? All of these points need to be spoken about. If they want us to live a longer life, they need to support us better.
So, as we were talking about with breast screening, the Mental Capacity Act can play a huge part in cervical screening as well. So, it's very important that when somebody is being asked about cervical screening, that we always assume somebody has capacity until we are given reason to believe that they don't. And the same kind of vein, it's really important that if somebody doesn't have capacity in another area, that we don't automatically assume that that means they don't have capacity in any area. All of these decisions are separate decisions and should be treated as such. So somebody should have their capacity assessed if you believe there is a reason to do so in this specific area. So using all the accessible information that we've talked about, we can then give that to the person to make sure that they have all of the information they'll need to make this informed choice. So all the pros, the cons, what's going to happen, what's expected of them. So if somebody has all that information, then they have the best shot at weighing up the information, making their decision, instead of what we don't want to happen, which is somebody is asked the questions, they've not been given the time to understand the information, or they might have been given the information in a way that they don't understand, so we're setting them up to fail in that capacity assessment. If somebody doesn't have capacity, then we can look at a best interest decision. Now, one thing that's really important to note here, a lot of feedback I've gotten while doing this project and speaking to people about barriers of cervical screening, is that if somebody phones up and asks a parent or carer of a person about cervical screening and they say no, then that is a situation where the parent or carer isn't in a place to make that decision single-handedly for that person. So we would ideally want to speak to that person specifically, and if they're unable to do so or engage with us in that way, then a best interest decision is also needed. The parents and carers' opinion is obviously very important, very valid, and very helpful, as they will often know that person the best out of anybody in the world. So their opinion should be listened to and held in that best interest decision, as well as the opinion of the actual person who we're talking about screening for. But it's important that we get everybody together to look at the risk and look at the options and make that robust best interest decision together. It's then important what we do with that information going forward. So if we decide that somebody doesn't have the mental capacity to make the decision and that it's not in their best interest, then where do we go from there? Just so that we're not saying no and then that person is just kind of left with the choice. We say no, and now what are we doing? So how are we going to keep this person safe going forward? Even if it's things like working towards one day having cervical screening, do we discuss opinions and opportunities if HPV self-swabbing becomes available for that person? Do we make sure that everybody in that person's care network knows what symptoms and signs we need to be looking out for? Do we discuss HPV vaccination if that's an option, if that's not something that's happened in the past? So there are options that we can look at that mean that person hasn't just been told no and then left. It's also important that we look at when are we going to review this decision. You know, these are things that can change. Somebody may have fluctuating capacity, somebody's life circumstances might change. So it's important that we're looking at when we can review these decisions.